Galizia, that, as you know very well, was assassinated 6 years ago in Malta. She was a journalist and she investigated about the so-called Panama Papers and corruption in Malta. And I got my personal copy of the book a few days ago, and I have to confess that I only read so far the first 3 or 4 chapters. And let me tell you that this is a very beautiful, nice book. It's not just a book about the relation between corruption and politics and investigation, but it's also about family history, about the relation between a mother and the 3 sons, who is the younger of 3. And I also, anytime we read a book, we will find something different depending on who we are. As you might know, I am an economic historian here, and Paul was training as an economic historian as well. Paul got a PhD from London School of Economics in 2015, and in the PhD dissertation that you can still download from the London School of Economics website, you see that there is already the interest about the regional development, the role of institutions, the role of corruption. At that time, the thesis was at the European level. But so this book is important also for you as students in economics, because corruption, there is empirical evidence, wide empirical evidence of that. There is a negative correlation between corruption and GDP, per capita GDP. So it is also something that you should keep really in mind as a student in economics. So corruption undermines growth and democracy as well. Paul, thank you really for being with us today. And you have about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for discussion by the team. Okay?
Introduction, and thank you all so much for coming. It's actually really nice to talk to students of local governments, because this story, as Carla mentioned, is of course about my mother's assassination, but it's really beneath it all a story about local governments and about the promises of globalization and the institutional failures that led to failures in those promises themselves. So the story starts in Malta, which is where I'm from, and I stupidly realized I put a map up of the village where I grew up in Malta, but not of the country itself. So the country is a group of islands just south of Sicily. And the story starts on the 16th of October 2017. So you can see home of Daphne, that's where I grew up. And there's really one road leading into our village, which is marked by the white line. So at exactly 2:58 p.m. on that day, a bomb under her car seat was detonated, and she died. So I know the exact time of that detonation, and actually the text message that was detonated the bomb, because for the past 6 years, my 2 older brothers and I was in and out of court. So you see the headline and related to the various court proceedings. So we had 3 hitmen who detonated that bomb, all of whom have been killed now, and a middleman who got a pardon in exchange for evidence on the murder. And then the Jorgen Fennick name you see there is the man who the prosecution claims committed the murder. And then you have another 3 men who are awaiting trial for supplying the bomb. So that's 8 men killed my mother. We've also had a public inquiry, which was Malta's first. So because Malta was a colony, we inherited a lot of English law, and there's a big tradition of public inquiries in England. And that developed a lot of evidence into the murder and those institutional failings I talked been working on this book about my mother. So the cover on the left is the UK cover, on the right the US cover. What you see in the middle is the foundation my brothers, my father and I set up. So all proceeds from the book go to that foundation, and I'll talk a bit more about the foundation because it is really central to this story. So the story is of course about the murder, but also the arc of my mother's life, and in many ways it was a very tragic arc. So she was born in 1964, September 1964, just 2 weeks after Malta decolonized from Britain. So the photo on the top left you see there is Malta's Independence Day, where you see the first Prime Minister of independent Malta being given what we call the Instruments of Independence. So a really big moment, obviously, in our country's history, and actually not a very old one. So both my parents were born as colonial subjects. And again, it looked like in that moment in history, the country would fulfill these promises it made itself. It would be proud and independent, it would be rich, it would be Western leaning, and manage on its own. You know, it could free itself of this idea that it had to be linked to a bigger power. And for many years in the 60s, so for my mother's early childhood, it looked like that would happen. The country was growing fast, it was changing, and it was developing a national identity. But then, as was the fashion at the time, so starting in the early 70s, the country elected a very left-leaning government, very socialist, in fact, and it was part of this wave around the world of newly formed states turning away from the West and away from NATO and towards what was then the Soviet Union, China, and in Malta's case, Libya. So the photo you see in the top right is Gaddafi, who ran Libya as a dictator for many years, together with Malta's Prime Minister, Don Mintoff, a very controversial Prime Minister, who ran the country for the whole of the 70s. And Mintoff really turned the country inwards. So those early ideas of what the country would be in the 60s became completely different. They were almost flipped. So that the idea of having a global and open economy became the opposite, right? We started using import substitution industrialization. So extremely high tariffs, quotas on certain products in order to develop a kind of domestic industry. But the idea didn't work because the market, so Malta at the time had a population of about 300,000 people with a very low average income. So the market could never be big enough to sustain any kind of domestic industry. So the country struggled and struggled. And in fact, the third photo you see on this slide is Mintoff, that same Prime Minister, with a man called Lord Carrington. So Lord Carrington was Britain's Foreign Secretary. You may have seen the news about David Cameron becoming the UK's Foreign Secretary. As a peer, it was the same situation here. And Mintoff turned to Britain in order to raise more money. So the country had a big naval base, and Britain and other NATO powers would pay rent, effectively, to use that naval base. So the country ended up with this very strange mix of being outwardly very pro-Soviet China, very closely allied to Gaddafi, but still, despite that, quite dependent on military expenditure from Britain. And another thing about the country that's important to know is it was and really remains intensely Catholic. So to give you a measure of that, the first time, one of the first times in my life that I voted was in 2011, and it was in a referendum on divorce. So divorce wasn't available in Malta until about 12 years ago. Abortion is still completely illegal. So more so then, the church was enormously powerful. And the lower photo you see here is Mintoff again speaking to the then Archbishop of Malta. So you have these two very powerful institutions, the governing Labour Party and the government itself, and the Catholic Church, and they were both vying for control of Maltese society. So in the top right, you see a very big protest. So that's dated in 1984. That protest was about the closure of church schools. So about a third of pupils in Malta attended schools run by the Catholic Church. Mintoff wanted to close those schools, of course, because they weren't, in line with the socialist principles, and they were also feeding. And so the opposition party exploited that to call a major protest. That had significance because it was the first time my mother was arrested. She was 19 years old. She was at that protest. And at that protest, she was attacked by a group of policemen, along with about 8 of her friends. So one policeman assaulted her, another kind of dragged her across the road. And later, and this is the kind of way the state operated at the time, it was my mother who was prosecuted. So my mother, after that, was charged with assaulting a police officer, with public disorder, with blocking a public road, and various other criminal charges. She was acquitted in a year later. But it speaks to the kind of country that developed, and how far that dream for the country drifted from 1964. So the photo in the top left is the remains of an arson attack on what was then the Times of Malta, so the country's newspaper of record, so an English language daily newspaper. So in '79, a group of Mintoff supporters stormed the building, broke inside, and tried breaking the printing machines, and attacking all the editors and journalists who were in the building, and then set it alight while keeping the doors closed. Again, the significance of that is, of course, because one of the ideas we were meant to take forward from '64 was of a free press and have a really democratic, free speech environment. So just 15 years after that, we had the country's newspaper of record being attacked in that way, in broad daylight. And as it happened, that building was right by the Prime Minister's office, who sanctioned the attack. Actually, later gave interviews saying, the newspaper never served the interests of the people. So this was the country my mother grew up in, and we're of course all formed by our environments, and the greater those forces, the stronger the impact. Now the funny thing about Malta is, because it was a British colony, a lot of people developed the ability to speak English, of course, and kept on in that way, and remained interested in the UK, so what was happening there, what people were writing about it. So some people in Malta subscribe to UK publications, and you see some of them here. So Punch no longer exists. Punch was a kind of satirical British political magazine. The Spectator, of course, still exists. It's a conservative magazine. And then, of course, there's Newsweek. And I deliberately chose that cover with Meryl Streep on it because it is such a contrast to Malta then. So the Malta my mother lived in was very black and white and grey. So there was only one brand of chocolate available. There was only one type of toothpaste. You could only buy one type of casual shoe. You could only get a colour television with a special license from the government. The same for a telephone. Yet, the kind of wider or Western world, the more colourful world, was brought through her and through her parents' subscriptions to these magazines. And she began reading them at home as a girl, later as a teenager, so now in the early 80s. And so this foreign alternative world was brought through her. And slowly, that kind of love of reading gave way to one of writing, but it would take a long time, or many more years, for that to actually turn into a job. Now, moving into the 80s, again, a new kind of fashion developed, and I don't know, certainly when I was a student, people were still talking about this book, but I don't know if you still are. So that book was published after the late 80s, but there have been a lot building up to it. So this idea of the end of history, that market liberalism had proved itself, that there was no need to keep experimenting with socialism or this or that. We had figured it out. It was democracy and open markets. And that was at the end of history. And that kind of idea started spreading around the world until, of course, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall and an almost near abandonment of those older socialist ideas. And the same is true for Malta. So the photo in the top right was Malta's kind of end of history moment, which came in '87. So in the 80s we had a number of unsolved murders, a lot of political violence, the kind of protests we saw earlier. And then by the time a really crucial general election was called for '87, the country was split almost perfectly down the middle, where people were asked to choose between one of two political parties. The Labour Party, which had been in power since '71, and represented those kind of pro-Soviet, pro-Gaddafi ideas, or an opposition party, the Nationalist Party, which wanted an alignment, or a realignment rather, with NATO and the West. And, as chance would have it, the opposition party won in '87, really by a whisker, so by a few thousand votes. And that marginal victory, I think, matters in retrospect, obviously, because what normally happens, or should happen in these situations, is you have a process of national reconciliation. So that the country comes together and says, look, what happened in the 70s and 80s, the violence, the power of the church, the turning west and then away from the west, we have to kind of address it. We have to speak openly about it, come to terms with it, and then the country can move forward. But because of the weakness of the party then and its marginal win it had, there was no real reconciliation. So despite those protests, murders, and corruption, the country, or the state rather, didn't prosecute a single corruption case from the 70s or 80s, right? So we have endemic corruption, yet not a single prosecution in the version. Again, there are largely unsolved murders from that period. And so Malta carried over into this kind of end of history world with that baggage. So it said, forget the reconciliation, we can just carry on. We can just carry on into market liberalism, and we'll leave these wounds open. And a key kind of part of that promise was to join the European Union. So here you have Malta signing its accession to join the European Union about 20 years ago, which was an important moment in the country's history. But again, the baggage carried over. So by now, my mother was a journalist writing for the Sunday Times of Malta. And her first big story was on a drug trafficker who would import masses of cocaine from South America via Italy, actually, as it happens, and into Malta. And again, this was my mother's first big story. And the story had significance not just as a criminal story, in that the drug trafficker's father just happened to be the brigadier, so the head of the armed forces of Malta. And it was the armed forces of Malta that had responsibility for controlling drug trafficking in the country. So the suspicion had been that the brigadier or the army was complicit in the trafficking. So she reported this in '94. Or 93 rather. In '94, a key source in her story was the Prime Minister's private secretary was stabbed, so there was an attempted murder on the Prime Minister's private secretary. And there were a number of arson attacks related to the case, including our house. So our house was set alight one day in '94, and was about 6, 7 years old. And of course I didn't see it at the time, but you know, it just looked like something that, again, the ugliness of what I carried in to a fast-growing present. So what you see here is a product of the kind of first wave of globalization that hit Malta, starting in the early 2000s. So a very big private development with a private marina, all owned by one family, a kind of oligarchic Maltese family, and Malta's first high-rise development, which you see in the background there. And at the time, Malta saw this as very exciting. You know, this is the product of that 1987 election, when this is the product of EU accession. This is the product of globalizing our economy. And no one saw it at the time, certainly I didn't see it, and I didn't think my mother really did, was that while the country's economy developed very rapidly and per capita income was rising very fast, right? So this is per capita GDP in Malta. We never properly reformed the institutions that were meant to deal with these global shifts. So effectively, the country's 1964 constitution remained as it was. We just decolonized. The office that once belonged to a colonial governor now belong to the Prime Minister of Malta. So the Prime Minister's office had these enormous powers to make appointments to the judiciary and the police force directly without any checks. And so we had this quite toxic mix of rapidly rising income, a fast globalizing economy, but very weak archaic institutions. And that really mattered until we come much closer to the present. So the Panama Papers, I don't know, this was in 2016. You're all a lot younger than I am. So some of you may know this, some might not. So in 2016, there was a leak, a massive leak, about 11 million documents from a law firm called Mossack Fonseca in Panama. And this law firm specialized in setting up shell companies, of course, in Panama, and providing various services like nominee directors to obscure the ultimate owners of those shell companies. Now, what is the attraction of shell companies like these, where you can hide ownership in a jurisdiction that is impenetrable to the jurisdiction's own prosecution? It's, of course, immediately attractive to criminals, to corrupt politicians. Thank you so much. And that's in fact what the leak revealed, right? So when journalists started reporting on the leak, they found, for example, the leaders of Pakistan had set up shell companies to receive millions of dollars in kickbacks, large-scale tax evasion, bribery schemes really around the world, right? These are records that go back to the 70s and public onwards. I think, though, not even people in Malta expected Malta itself to feature in the leak. So, in 2016, my mother was one of the journalists reporting on the Panama Papers. And in the leak, she found two very senior Maltese politicians had set up companies in Panama just a few days, in fact 4 days after they were elected to government. So you see the first one on the left, a man called Peach Kemry, who was the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, right? So an incredibly senior government post. The man on the right, Conrad Mitzi, was the country's Minister of Energy and the Minister in charge of privatization projects. The man in the middle is an accountant who set up the companies, who I can speak more about later. In the background, you see a power station, right? So Malta is so small, it only has one power station. In 2013, when their government was voted in, its main electoral pledge was to change the country's power supply from oil, or heavy fuel oil, to gas, or LNG. Now, changing that supply required changing the entire infrastructure. So there was a public contract put out to build an entirely new privatization of power station, and of course the supply network. And you see it's built on a coast because the gas is brought in by shipment on these huge tankers. Now, the deal itself, I'll speak more about in a second, but again it's a product of Malta's turn towards more global markets. But at the time my mother was reporting on this story, she only had these bits of information, right? So two very senior Maltese government officials set up secret Panama companies shortly after they were elected. She didn't know why, she just knew they owned it. She started developing an idea that they were somehow connected to this power station a little later. So a few months after she broke that story, right, and the country erupted in protests, she got another tip about another company. Only this company was registered in the United Arab Emirates, so in a free trade zone close to Dubai. And the company was called 17 Black. And again, you see here the same man, Shkembri. The next man next to him kind of broke the power station deal. The next was the Prime Minister of Malta, one of those you see again. Now, if you look, so this is from her own blog, and it's dated February 22nd, 2017. So that's when she broke the 17 Black story. And for the last few months of her life, she worked very hard to uncover who owned this company, right? But she didn't have it, because there was no such need for documentation from UAE free trade, so neither was in the Panama Papers. So she just knew this company was somehow connected to those other companies. And of course, she never got there, because that was February 2017. In October, she was killed. So this is a memorial in Valletta, now a capital city, which people began laying flowers and candles and notes to my mother. And it still exists to this day. So the memorial itself became quite an important site in Malta. I don't know if you know the case of a once famous Russian politician, Boris Nemtsov, who was killed outside the Kremlin. And after his murder, protesters began what they call the living memorial to Nemtsov. And it's a living memorial because almost every day, the Kremlin sends people to flare away the memorial. Every day people go back and bring flowers and candles again. And the same was true to Malta. So there were government orders to have the memorial flared every day until a constitutional court ruling came down saying every single breach, and there were hundreds, right, because there were daily clearances, amounted to a breach of protesters' human rights. Well, there we are. So one of the things my two other brothers and I did after the murder is start campaigning. So that meant traveling to the European Parliament, to Washington, to Strasbourg, or the Council of Europe, really anywhere where MEPs and Council of Europe members would speak to us, right? And that's very sensitive to its international relations. So any institutional outside pressure you can bring to bear on the country has real effect. Right? So Malta can't behave like Poland or like Hungary, say. It has to kind of listen to the European Union, listen to the Council of Europe. But one other thing we did, and the irony here is we thought this might be the least effective thing, is we began speaking to other investigative journalists about my mother's work. So because she never got to finish her stories, she had piles of material. And it was more than we could work on. So we began sharing it. Initially with journalists from The Guardian, which has a big investigations team in the UK, and Reuters, which has globally a big investigations team. And over time, without us even knowing, those journalists started putting in more journalists. So you see, yeah, this is like Deutsche Zeitung, La Repubblica, the New York Times, Le Monde, and again, The Guardian. And they formed a big collective that in the end they would call the Daphne Project, that picked up my mother's stories and starting in 2018 began developing them and furthering her work. And that was the first day of their launch, so they will have front pages. But perhaps there were two really crucial stories in this reporting. The first was this, so the power station that I mentioned. So that privatization contract wasn't just for the power station or the infrastructure, it was for the supply of gas itself, right? Because Malta switched from oil to gas. And the way the government of Malta contracted that gas supply is drawn out in this chart that The Guardian ran in one of their Magna project pieces. So Malta signed a deal with a company called SOCAR, which is the state-owned energy company of Azerbaijan. Only that company had no energy of itself to sell in Malta. And so why did Malta contract with it in the first place is the big question the piece asks. What SOCAR did is buy the gas from Shell, which you know, for that price over there, $113 million, right? This is for a year's supply of gas. It then sold it on to Malta's energy company for $153 million, right? So there is an unaccounted for $40 million difference. And that company, Electrogas Malta, is the new private company that was formed. The deal was that it would sell electricity generated to Malta's state-owned energy company. So Malta was locked into this agreement for 18 years. So 18 years, buying gas, or electricity rather, from a private company that was overpaying for it from a state-owned company from Azerbaijan. So again, the question of the why, at the time we of course had no answers. So this was 2018. Now, the next, I said there were two stories that really mattered in the Daphne project reporting. This was the second, and it weirdly came almost a year, exactly a year after the murder. And it's a story Reuters ran with the Times of Malta. And the story was that the company I mentioned earlier, 70 Black, which was registered in the UAE, was owned, Reuters found, by the man who owns the power station. Right? So suddenly the puzzle started falling into place. You have two Panama companies owned by Maltese government officials, the officials who awarded the contract to this Maltese businessman. And the Maltese businessman, it turns out from this story, had his own company, his own one secret company. So subsequent reporting found that the kickback scheme was this, that the government always planned to hand this huge privatization project to this man, and the man would then kick back some of the proceeds of that contract via his company to their Panama companies. And the size of that kickback scheme is hard to tell, because in a way the reporting stopped it. But what we know from documents uncovered by journalists is that the plan was, at least for a year, for the power station owner to send 5,000 euros per day to each government official. Right? This is a country where a minister is on a 65,000 euro salary. So these are huge sums of money. And again, Malta was locked into that arrangement for about 17 or 18 years. So for all we know, it was set to go 5,000 euros or dollars a day times 18 years, times 200. So this is November 2018. Now, again, weirdly, almost exactly a year to the date of that story, so we're now in November 2019, the power station owner is arrested, right? Jorgen Fenech. If you recognize that name is because it was on the second slide. So Jorgen Fenech was arrested on suspicion of commissioning my mother's murder. And he was arrested while trying to flee the country on his yacht, because it was his family, the Fenech family, that owns and built this development. So at about 5 in the morning, on 19, or the 20th of November 2019 rather, Fenech ordered his yacht and tried to sail to Sicily. So it would have been maybe an hour voyage. Only he was intercepted by the armed forces of Malta about 10 minutes out of that marine. So when Fenech was arrested in November 2019, the country erupted in protest. And you see some of those scenes here. You see Fenech's yacht actually at the top after it was pulled back into the marina. The signs that say Barra means out in Maltese, and those are protesters outside Parliament. The other sign, blood on your hands, enough corruption, very much loose means a mafia government. Because it was Fenech's arrest that was the kind of key that unlocked this story that was hiding in plain sight for really about 3 years at that point, right? 3 years since the Panama Papers. And the country erupted in protest precisely because they'd been lied to, right? For those years, the government said this has nothing to do with journalism. It certainly has nothing to do with the government. It wasn't an assassination, it was just a murder or something like that. And so that November things became obvious. It became obvious that it wasn't just a crime story in the traditional sense. It was a story about organized crime in the broader sense, that you had criminal activity reaching very far into government. In fact, in this case, into the Prime Minister's office. And so protests day and night. This is a protest outside Parliament. Day and night, a protest down Aula, the capital's main street. Protesters carrying, this is my mother's portrait, which you may have seen in previous photos. Now, there is real significance to these protests because I mentioned at the start, Maltese society was really controlled by the church and its political parties. And that situation took over immediately after colonialism. So, it's like the colonial government left, immediately the church tried to dominate, and the parties. And so Malta never really developed any sense of civic society. So there were, up until this point, very few NGOs, certainly no democracy or rule of law NGOs, like you might have even in Russia. And there were no spontaneous protests. The protest from 1984 was organized by the opposition party. So protests were always called by the church or the parties, or both. In this case, for the first time in Malta's post-colonial history, we had spontaneous protests. So we had, for the first time, Maltese people coming together spontaneously to call for the kind of country they wanted, not for a political party, not against another party, but just to say this isn't the Malta we want, and realizing that the statehood that really landed in our laps in '64 had gone horribly wrong. Now another part of the campaign, which I mentioned at the start, was the public inquiry into my mother's death. So the idea behind public inquiries is that you get an inquiry that goes beyond criminal accountability. So in murders like this, you of course have suspects and perpetrators and they've been charged, right? 8 men. But then you have these much broader failings, and you have liability that exists across the state. So the question in this case is, what did the state know? Or what should the state have known? Because the corruption scheme, of course, involved the government itself. My mother was left unprotected, right? At the end of the day, in Malta, we saw the murder of a journalist rather than a magistrate, a judge, a police officer, or a politician. It was a journalist. And that speaks to a lot of things, but it speaks to total institutional failure. So it's when institutions fail, right? The police force fails, the judiciary fails, that you have to rely completely on the former state, that you have to rely on journalists. And the thing about journalists is they don't have powers granted by the state. They can't compel evidence. they don't carry arms, they're just reporters. And that makes them very vulnerable. So for 2 years we campaigned for that public inquiry. The only way of achieving it was to get the Prime Minister to convene one. So the Prime Minister has the power to convene one. He of course didn't want to. But we lobbied at the Council of Europe to threaten sanctions on Malta should it not convene a public inquiry. So the Council of Europe did exactly that. It gave Malta a deadline for an inquiry. The inquiry started, as it happens, a month after Fenech's arrest, and it reported in 2021. And there is a lot in that inquiry report. If you are interested in questions of institutional failure and what economists and political scientists call state capture, then the inquiry report is really good reading, and we had it translated into English. And it heard a lot of primary evidence from over 100 witnesses. But the bottom line of that public inquiry report is in this Guardian piece, or Reuters piece rather, and that the finding was that the Maltese state bears responsibility for her death because the institutions that were meant to protect her failed to protect her. So, in human rights language, members of the Council of Europe likely have a positive obligation to protect life. So it's incumbent on the state to protect life. It's especially incumbent on the state to protect lives that are obviously at risk. And so the finding of the inquiry was that the state failed those obligations. And so now the question for Malta, or the ones that really were raised at the start of my mom's life in '64, and it's what kind of country Malta wants to be. So it went from colonialism to pro-West and NATO, to pro-Soviet Union and hierarchy, back to the EU, to really a complete takeover by organized crime. And as it's slowly peeling back at corruption, it has to ask itself a very important question in that how does it want to govern itself? How does it want to govern itself as an independent nation in the 21st century? I wish I could say it wants to govern itself well, but it hasn't yet started implementing the recommendations of the public inquiry. There has been some constitutional changes in the country, but given how far it has fallen, it's nowhere near enough. And that's the final slide. I don't know if you have questions, but thank you so much. So it's a really good question, and I keep thinking about it because the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister from 1987, who said we're going to go through a process of national reconciliation, ultimately decided to just leave things as they are, right? That was the problem. And he in his memoirs, he says, that was really not to make people feel like we are seeking revenge. But I suspect it always had more to do with political power, that So how should it have happened? I think is how it was meant to happen, at least on paper. So the government set up what they call the Permanent Commission Against Corruption. And this was meant to be a board led by a retired senior judge and other members of the judiciary that would examine corruption cases and pass them on to the police for prosecution. Only it just didn't do it. And so people lost faith in the process entirely. The commission still exists today, but most of these people out there, anything have never heard of it. And there was one minister, for example, who was hideously corrupt, notoriously corrupt, and was meant to be prosecuted. But it took so long to bring a case, he just died, and the commission said, oh well. But I think you have to do these things, that you don't make them about the person, you make them about signals. And the signal has to be, this is a state that thinks corruption is wrong, whoever commits it, and this is a state that will prosecute it. And by the way, we're going through that process again now, right? We're talking about 87, but it's happening now. It's happening in 2023. Those men are on the board, and not a single one has faced corruption charges over the power station deal, the Magna companies. We're again where we were in 87. And I think the real test of the country now, if it is going to think of itself as a successful state, is to bring those prosecutions. Maybe they'll fail. You know what I mean? You don't launch a prosecution short of a conviction, but you have to at least send a signal that there is rule of law, basically.
So my name is Federico. I just wanted to ask, was the Daphne Foundation ever publicly hindered from trying to continue their investigation, or privately, in some cases, by organized crime or by anonymous actions, physically and maybe also politically, or in terms of media coverage?
So yes, I'm making me realize I forgot to talk about the foundation. So we set up the foundation in 2018, and we set it up as a vehicle to fight a lot of ongoing legal cases. So another thing I didn't mention is my mother was sued for libel a lot. Malta has very restricted libel laws. At the time of her death, she was facing 47 libel suits. At the time, we still have criminal libel. I know it exists in Italy. And those suits passed on to us, so me and my brothers, because we are heirs and plaintiffs have some damages against the estate. And the estate was us, right? So we have to set up a kind of vehicle to continue fighting and raise money for the widows. The short answer to your question is yes, in that the foundation is registered as a charity in Malta. There were attempts to stop us from even registering the charity and attempts to kind of change its stated aims, change its name, and so on. And of course, there were other things, maybe not so much the charity, but my brothers and I, we've been harassed quite a lot. My brother's being sued and said, yes, I mean, the risk environment is still very difficult. Any journalist or campaigner who continues that work faces those same risks.
My name is Turjan, I'm from Dijon, and you mentioned that it mostly about the failure of institutions, and unfortunately I see for many years the cases when a lot of independent journalists being murdered, and my question is, what can ordinary people do to protect lives of independent journalists, and especially in very repressive regimes where demand of society, where government is indifferent to the demand of society?
So, a really good question. And I think the answer varies, like you suggested, based on whether the environment is really repressive or simply totally corrupt, like Malta. So in Malta, my brothers and I have always said, in our opinion, that the best way to protect journalists is to act on what they report. So in Malta, we have this absurd situation where my mother revealed the existence of these Magna companies. And there were a lot of other corruption stories, by the way. And they would just burst into the public domain, right? She would report them. Sometimes other papers would pick them up, but nothing would happen, right? Nothing would happen. You'd think, and if a state found out that senior politicians had these Magna companies, they'd be called in for questioning under very easy by the police. Well, they weren't. And the best way of protecting journalists is to do that, right? Because if you don't, then the journalist is totally exposed. Because those politicians and businessmen know they only need to target the journalists. They're not fighting off the prosecutor, the police, the judiciary. They're fighting off the journalist. In this case, my mother, a 52-year-old woman, who did most of her writing on her own. And so this is why I said, it was she that was killed rather than a police officer, a soldier, politician. So fixing the institutions in corrupt environments. In repressive environments, I have no experience of that. I speak, of course, to journalists who do work in those environments. And they will always tell you at least one of the same things, which is that they need international support. If it's not going to come domestically, then they need the support of other journalists. So the stories Russian journalists used to be able to report on and mattered outside Russia, right? We learned that in a really ugly way last year. And if only journalists outside Russia picked up on their work a bit more. So in London, where I live, it's the place where the proceeds of Russian corruption land, right? You can't move for Russian oligarchs in London, maybe not anymore. But it was a weird situation to have journalists in Russia reporting on corruption, the oppression regime there. And then journalists in the UK almost glamorizing Roman corruption, how exciting it was just. And I feel that was a really failing, actually, of our profession. Thank you.
We do have time for more questions. If you want to come here. Or, hey, while waiting for your additional questions, I do have another question for you. Somewhere, there is this memorial that you mentioned before in Magna, right?
Yeah.
And I got a picture of this memorial a couple of days ago. There is a colleague of mine there. And so in my smartphone, I had the opportunity to make a zoom of this picture. And somewhere there is written, she was killed because she mattered, right? And so this is, I believe, an important sentence. The story that we listen today is again a story about the institution and corruption and the way society works. And so it is not really a story about a single episode, a single journalist. It's much more than that. In the world of economies and institutions are more and more important. The effect of any economic policy really is mediated by the institution that we have. Okay? So I really hope that you will take the opportunity and the possibility to read this book. And by the way, we do have a copy of the book in our library, so you can forward the book and read it. Because it is not just the story about one relatively small country, perhaps 500,000 inhabitants or so, or one single journalist. It's much more than that. It's about the institutions, in democracy. So
So I wanted to ask, we know that on the 19th of October, there was the organ condemned by the European Union over this kind of this assassin. But I wanted to ask, what do you think that will be the role of the European Union over this case? Thank you.
Thank you. So the European Union was a really central part of our campaign. In fact, one of the first trips we took was a few days after the letter to the European Parliament. And Parliament passed a resolution to report on the rule of law in Malta and sent a delegation of MPs, and which kind of interviewed people and then reported that we have real concerns. Now that, it might not sound like much, but was extremely important, because when you have these populist governments, and it was a populist government, incredibly popular, they are able to create a domestic environment that's almost shielded from international pressure. And when that delegation came, it was almost like that shield was pierced, you know, and suddenly people in Malta started saying, hang on, maybe there are really serious problems. So I'd say that supranational check is really important in drawing attention, even domestically, right? It's weird, you have to go outside the country to get the country to reflect on itself. There were more formal measures that were actually being considered at that point. So Article 7, I think people talked about it a lot when Poland was going through its own rule of law crisis. There is an article that allows the European Commission to suspend members from the Union, which is a kind of like a final policy. And actually, for a month, it looked like it might happen with Malta. So that is a really formal tool that can be used. The first was a less formal tool, although it involved the parliamentary vote and the delegation. And then, the funny thing though is this: we went first to the European Union, but it was the Council of Europe that turned out to be the more effective supranational body. Because it's the Council of Europe that maintains the Convention of Human Rights. And that comes with formal powers, right? There is a human rights court. The Council has the power to appoint a special rapporteur, which it did in my mother's case. So it's only ever appointed rapporteurs. With the case of Boris Nemtsov, Anna Politkovskaya, Russian journalist, Sergei Magnitsky, and my mother. And those rapporteurs were sent by the Council of Europe. They studied the country and so on, and report back. And it was through that mechanism that we generated the pressure that caused this government in the economic life. So that both bodies, the EU and Council of Europe, have hugely important roles to play. And I often think about campaigners in other jurisdictions where there are these supranational checks. And if Malta were in that situation, it's becoming a complete disaster. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, was it taken into consideration the fact that your mother was a journalist when reviewing the case? Was it considered aggravating circumstance or maybe a stricter sentence as it has been in prior murders of journalists?
It's a good question actually, because the short answer is in law in Malta, no. There is no idea of it being an aggravating factor. But the broader answer is yes. And at the start of the campaign, we were very clear that it mattered that she was a journalist. It mattered because of what she was reporting on. And she was killed, she was obviously killed for what she was reporting on, so you need to look to the stories, because in the stories like the motive, and you wouldn't believe how long it took us to get that case across. And there are various reasons for that. The first is that Malta has no tradition in the police force of working closely with victims, right? So I don't know how it works in Italy, but in the UK we have a liaison support officer. So we didn't have that. We were shut out of the investigation completely. We would just have to write letters to the police commissioner. And then it was in the civil courts that we were able to exploit that document. So there was a really key constitutional case we filed against the police force to have a certain police officer removed from the investigation. A police officer was married to a cabinet minister, and someone my mother reported on it. And in our claims in court, we said, look, this is really about the murder of a journalist, and the journalist who reported on this person. It cannot be right that a subject of her reporting is overseeing the investigation into her murder. So we won that case, actually, and it's a kind of landmark ruling, so maybe things will change.
Hello, my name is Pietro Villabagnasca from GT1, and I wanted to ask if, in your opinion, the current economy of Malta is ripe for corruption even more, because it's really going in a direction to collapse, and there is a lot of tourism finalized towards the type of activities that are corruption to crime, and I was there this summer and I saw a lot of construction sites everywhere. So it's obviously innovating and renovating the island, but I also saw clubs and big, really big hotels, luxury places, but not everywhere, just in a few located neighborhoods like Sevilla.
Yes, so the answer is yes. Early on, when Malta first started globalizing the economy, the GDP of Malta was a quarter tourism, for example. Now it's shifted. So online, what they call iGaming, which is basically online gambling. Online gambling alone accounts for at least 10% of our GDP. And as a sector, it's like you said, it's really ripe for corruption. Because it allows you to launder the proceeds of crime very, very easily. Because it's very easy to generate fake bets, using fake accounts. And in fact, that's what it's used for. A lot of it, as it happens, is used to launder the proceeds of mafia here in Italy, so the proceeds from drug trafficking. We've had some really important cases. And then construction, you mentioned, there is enormous corruption in land use in Malta. Right, we have a single regulator, planning authority, or the head of the authority is appointed by the government, and the biggest political donors are property developers, right? So no government is ever really going to realistically restrict planning. Another problem we have is political donations are completely anonymous in Malta, which is, but it is a highly financialized economy, and with very weak checks on sectors that are very prone to corruption. Hi.
I'm Terrazi, I'm a G2. And since in your speech at some point you mentioned the fact that despite the huge economic and social changes in Malta, most of our still rests in the hands of the Prime Minister as it did with the governor, I guess, during incoming times. So my question is that, is the foundation or civil society Malta in general pushing for a constitutional reform in that sense to take some power out of the central government? And how is that working out? Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because, yes, the foundation is doing that. So the foundation's first priority is justice for my mother and her story. But we're hoping we will get that one day, and when that does happen, the focus will shift more intensely than it is now on rule of law reform. So I mentioned that case, that constitutional case about removing a police officer. So that set a landmark precedent in the way whether investigations are run, really any investigations are run. We won another landmark ruling in the Constitutional Courts on free speech. So there was a time, about 3 years ago, we had big banners printed calling for justice for my mother, and we hung them up around our laptop. And the planning authority ripped them down without notice. So we sued the planning authority, won a ruling, so now you can't hang the banners outside the election. And we've also set up what we call, America has a great tradition of this. The UK doesn't really, and I don't know about the rest of Europe, but what we call public interest litigation. So, so we set up what we call a public interest litigation network, which means a network of lawyers who are willing and able to take on constitutional and human rights cases that will change law, right? That will land on cases. That they're in effect fighting not just on behalf of a single claimant, but for the society. And that started, and it's taken on a really very range of cases around asylum and treatment of asylum seekers. And really the lesson there was we were so let down by the political process, by Parliament and government, that we started turning to institutions that still function at least a little bit, to the judiciary. So we turned to the judiciary and said, look, there are challenges, and can we get to the rulings that will change things? And that is happening. And for me personally, it's been a lesson in the power of human rights law, actually, to force really radical change. And we support journalists as well, to kind of bring in more varied, more strong voices in all of us. But ultimately, yes, we do want to move completely away from a situation where that can never happen again, where you can have a Prime Minister operating with almost no check.
Good afternoon, my name is Amin. I wanted to ask, but basically it's mostly about your concern. So in this case, that as we could see in cases that government gets the judiciary powers, executive powers, legislative powers, and the economic powers, well, basically democracy dies and corruption rises. So in these cases, the only place that people can trust to be updated are journalists, and they will be certainly persecuted. So my main question is that what will happen now? What should we do? So this is my main question. Thank you.
It's a good question and a very difficult problem. And it's the problem that the country found itself in, right? Effectively, there was only one journalist who was doing that kind of reporting. Yet another corruption scheme my mother uncovered was that the managing director of the Times, a Malta newspaper of record, was receiving kickbacks from the Prime Minister's chief of staff. So that paper was also compromised. So what you do is hope to turn to civil society, really. So I mentioned the judiciary. In Malta, luckily we still have members of the judiciary who are compromised. And just because of the way a judiciary works, right, it depends on individuals. So an individual judge or a panel of 3 judges, you can work with that system, right? So the police force is different because the police force is a force. You know, whether the homicide detective is not corrupt almost doesn't matter if his seniors are corrupt, right? Because it ends there, whereas the judiciary works differently. So we can that. And then what happened in response to the murder is a civic society did start developing really after the murder. And it started with a group of women who got together and started camping outside the Prime Minister's office on the night of the murder. And that group continued, they called themselves Occupy Justice. And you need that because although it shouldn't work like this, if journalists see there is a demand for their work, that people don't seem to care, that there's apathy in the work, right? If society becomes apathetic, everyone becomes apathetic. The judges, the police officers, the system just dies. So you see that developing, right, and the monthly vigils, that memorial, the protests, it kind of emboldens people, it emboldens judges, it emboldens police officers, and all civil society groups. So I would say, at least in Malta, and probably in a lot of other places, that ultimately it really rests on civil society, on the people themselves, rather than the institutions.
My question is, do you think, how is the situation there right now? Do you think there still exists the same threats related to mafia issues connected with the government? And if so, then how is the situation for the journalists there in right now, I mean, in today's world? How is the situation there for the journalists?
So the government collapsed during those protests, which was a big moment, right? Malta is the kind of country where politicians never resign, no matter what. But then all of a sudden it just changed, and the government collapsed, the Prime Minister resigned, incredibly popular Prime Minister resigned. And the same political party is still in power, but with a new cabinet. So that was one significant change. There have been some minor constitutional changes. So it used to be that the Prime Minister can, for example, appoint and remove the police commissioner without any checks. No governance checks, no parliamentary checks, nothing. That's changed now. There are some checks on how that appointment is made. Another change is we've split the Attorney General. So the Attorney General in Malta used to be both prosecutor and advisor to the government, which is terrible in a corrupt country. We now have 2 separate bodies. And on how the situation is for journalists, the answer is it's still bad and it's still difficult. And so one thing the public inquiry did is there's a lot of recommendations to make Malta safer for journalism. And none of them have been implemented. So that's quite a useful measure of where we are and where we've come from. And one important change is, of course, now people look at Malta, whereas before I said they didn't. And it's much harder to commit crimes under a spotlight. But in summary, it's still very difficult and still quite unsafe.
So, my name is Helen, and I believe that I actually saw your mother's story. It was a very big headline in South Africa on Al Jazeera. They kept streaming it for a few days, mainly because in South Africa they do have a lot of investigative journalists, especially female journalists. So I was very surprised to see there, like, what are the odds? And then I realized that there's a problem with the media, like, something is big for a day or two, and then it just dies off. So it was quite incredible to hear the continuation of the story, and I was wondering if you have made any plans to, like, create an outreach to places like South Africa, maybe Asia, like, to keep that alive because it's not a fight that can be won, alone. So what plans are you making into other countries and keeping it alive?
That's a very kind question. It's funny, in Malta no one really talked about state capture, and it certainly wasn't the new. And one of the challenges we had was expressing it. And I'm afraid to say we pointed to South Africa as an example of what happened. It was a slightly different kind of state capture, but it was. And I don't know. I think the international pressure was an essential part of the campaign. And we relied on countries more that have formal ties to the European Union and the Council of Europe. Washington, our relations with America are quite important. And now that the UK is a part of the EU, yes, Ukraine has quite important relations. We relied on that as well. And the thing about my mother's story is that it allowed for a really sustained campaign because there were so many corruption stories she reported on that were unresolved and that spread across a lot of different jurisdictions. And because the criminal proceedings stretched on very long. But look, it was a full-time job, right? At a point, my brothers and I were working at all for months. You're in the head of NGOs. We have, 1, 2, 3, 4 lawyers working for us in Malta, another 4 lawyers working for us in the UK bringing human rights claims. And my sense is it shouldn't have to be like that. And we've always said that we should. Like, what if my mother didn't have 3 adult children, right? It would be a mess. And what if these lawyers didn't offer to help us grow up? Would we start? And my one hope is the whole story and campaign just changes things permanently so that we don't have to do this. No one has to do this again. And that no one has to kind of put on a suit and tie and lobby around the European Parliament, as they were with Google or with So I would love to come to South Africa and do that, but part of me is quite tired.
My question for you is, you talked about going on from one parliament to the European Parliament and roaming for seeking for justice. Since you are someone who works in journalism, so was your mother. And I want to know, now you have a book that is out there, and I really want to know how the publishing industry did treat you, and was it any different from the system or institutional failure? Did writing industry treat you any better than the institution or government?
Which industry? Publishing?
Publishing industry, yes.
The publishing industry. So I certainly didn't set out to write a book, and the idea came to us probably too early, and I wasn't ready for it. I was treated very well, actually, and I think that's because the editor who first picked up on the story was someone who wanted to know the story, right, for personal reasons. She is herself a mother, cares quite deeply about journalism, and wanted it to be told actually not in a kind of sensationalist way, but the opposite. So she said, this is a story about a mother and her children, and you should tell it in that way. But of course, I know very varied experiences in publishing. Mine happened to be good precisely because the editors, both in the UK and the US, were motivated to do this story for their own very personal reasons. It was never, go to make money. By the way, all the proceeds from the book go to the foundation. And so that helped it a lot. And the writing itself became very important, all those territories. On journalism, there are horrible journalists, there are horrible people in every industry and sector. And we certainly were contacted by a lot of them. And I always personally work out my journalists who go to instances with respect, or stories with respect. But then there are really great journalists, a lot of whom work on the Daphne project, who have shown extraordinary kindness and bravery, and have shown what a good institution journalism can be.
Hello. So after all of this, do you feel like you've been betrayed by the institutions?
Yes. Yes, it's for sure.
On the
On the
personal
personal level. I do. I think maybe we all grew up with an idea that a crime is committed, an institution takes into action, and it comes to a resolution. And the idea to me that a now 6-year campaign, and probably a rest of my life campaign, is necessary to get institutions to do what they should be doing in the first place. It's just not where you want to be. Right? You can't go through this. A state can't go through this every time someone's murdered, every time there's a case of political corruption. And I sort of have fallen in and out of love with my country, but there was a time I really thought it was a great place to live, that the institutions were, and so I do.